In this screencast, we're going to start adding authentication and authorization to our users and messages app. And the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that I'm working with a different database. So I'm going to head over to my dunder-init.py. I'm going to make sure I'm connected to users, messages, we'll call this bcrypt. That's going to be the module that we're using for some authentication. And back in the terminal, I'm going to create db, users, messages, bcrypt. Now, if I actually try to run my migrations now, I'm going to run into an issue. Python manage py db upgrade. I already have my migrations, but can't import name db. So why is that happening? Well, let's take a look at our manage.py. And that's because I'm trying to import something from my app. We got to make sure that's from project. So once we replace that, let's try to run that again. And it looks like we're in better shape. Right now, let's psql users messages bcrypt. Let's make sure that we have those tables. And it looks like we have users and messages. Excellent. Back in our application, we need to start thinking about how to add bcrypt to our application. The first thing we're going to want to do is actually install that dependency. And that is Flask-Bcrypt. So we'll give that a second to install. And it looks like we got it there. Great. You might have this already. If not, make sure you install it. Back in our models.py, we want to make sure that we're including the logic necessary to hash a password when a user is saved. So inside of our models.py, we're going to need to add a couple things. Right now, we just have a first name and a last name. Let's add some additional columns. We're going to add a username. It's going to be a db.column. We're going to make this another db.text, but we're going to make sure that this is unique. We're also going to have to handle errors later on for users that are duplicate entries. And along with the username, we want a password. And this is going to be, once again, a db.column with db.text. But you know you don't want to store passwords in plain text. So where do we actually store passwords? Well, that happens in the dunder init. So back here, let's make sure we add something for a username and for a password. And we can do self.username is username because that's okay being in plain text. But there's a problem if we try to just do this right here. This would be a terrible thing, as we'd be storing passwords in plain text. So what we're going to do is make sure that we import a variable called bcrypt. Now we might not have this yet, and that's okay. We're going to make that in a second. But we are going to invoke the bcrypt.generate password on whatever that plain text password is that's about to be saved. And this will work fine, but it actually runs into an issue with string encoding. So we want to just make sure that we decode this into the correct format, which is UTF. What we're doing here is every time that a user is saved, we're correctly hashing the password and then putting it into the database. We want to make sure we don't store passwords in plain text in our database. If someone ever were to get access to our database, they would have all those passwords. That would be a huge security breach. So it's really important that we have this code right here. But we're using this bcrypt variable and we don't have that yet. So what we need to do is make sure that we import it in our dunder-init.py. So what we're going to do is make sure that from Flask-Bcrypt, we import the bcrypt class. And we've seen this pattern before. What do we do with that bcrypt class? Once again, make a variable called bcrypt. This is what we're going to import in another file. That's the result of the bcrypt class being instantiated with our Flask application. This is going to allow us to check passwords and to hash passwords. That's what we're using bcrypt for. It's going to be the algorithm that we use for one-way encryption or for hashing passwords. What do we need to do next? We have to make sure that we're actually storing this information in the database. So we're going to Python manage py db migrate. Let's go make sure that we get those columns. It's generating this right here, detected unique constraint on username, detected column username. Great. Let's make sure that we run Python manage py db upgrade. Let's go run this right here and let's hop into PSQL. Inside of here, let's select star from users. And it looks like we don't have a relation users. Well, I'm not connected to the right database. Always make sure users, messages, bcrypt. Let's try this again. Select star from users. That looks a lot better. ID, first name, last name. Let's take a look at our users table. And it looks like we're in good shape. We have a unique constraint on the username. We have a primary key. It's referenced in messages, and we have these fields that we're looking for. You're not going to see the password hashing being done right here, so you don't ever want to do things like insert into users. Don't do that. You're going to let Python do that for you. Inside of PSQL, we saw that our database looks good. now we actually have to write the code to start storing usernames and passwords. So let's write the code to do that. The first thing we want to make sure is that our forms are set up to do that. So inside of project, users, forms, you can always use Command P as well. We're going to have to change some things about our user form. What kind of things are we going to have to change about our user form? We're going to need to add fields for a password and for a username. So we can say that a username is a string field. We'll give that a label of username. And we'll make sure that we give that as well a validators of data required. Make sure that you always have a username. Let's do the same thing with password and see if you can spot anything that might be wrong here. Well, remember that a string field is just a text input, and we don't really want our passwords to be typed in plain text where they can be visible. So we're going to use a password field and make sure that we import that as well inside. So this is what our user form is going to look like. We're eventually going to need another form to handle logging in, but for now, this user form will be used to create and edit users. So where do we use that? Inside of views, or inside of users, views, Command P to find that. We got to make sure we use that user form. Now, if we take a look at the user that we're creating, we're getting the first name and the last name, but we're going to need a little bit more information. So why don't we get the first name, the last name? Since we're using WT forms, we can clean this up a little bit by simply saying form.firstname.data and form.lastname.data. But since we're going to be inserting multiple things, let's clean this up a little bit. We're also going to want a form.username.data and a form.password.data. Then we'll add that and commit it and redirect to user's index. Let's see what happens if we start this application. Python app.py. I'm going to head over in the browser to localhost 3000. And I'm going to go to add a new user. And I'm going to add a first name of Ellie, a last name of Shopik, a username of eShopik, and a password that I won't tell you. When I add this user, Bcrypt object has no attribute generate password hash. Well, that's because I just spelled that incorrectly. So let's head over to our models.py. Let's make sure that we call that generate password hash. Back in the browser, I can refresh this page and try to submit again. And it looks like I have a user right here, Ellie Shopik. I'm going to try to add a new user now. We'll call this Bob Shopik. Don't have a Bob in the family, but that will work. But I want the same username. And when I add a user, let's see what happens. Oof. SQLalchemy.exe or exceptions, integrity error, duplicate key violates unique constraint users. Well, this is a good thing. What this is telling me is that I've inserted a duplicate user, but what I need right now is a better way to handle this logic so that my application doesn't crash. So what I'll do inside of here, inside of my views.py, is import something from SQLalchemy exceptions. From SQLalchemy.exe, we're going to import integrity error. What is integrity error? Well, if you take a look right here, to make sure that I'm actually spelling that correctly, that looks good. Integrity error is the error that is raised when a username that already exists is trying to be added again. So before we go and create this user, let's try to actually run this code. We're going to put this all inside of a try block. And if that all works, we'll keep going as per usual. What we then want to do is make sure that we handle this exception. So we'll say except integrity error. And what do we want to do if an integrity error is raised? Well, we can flash username already taken. And once again, we can return this new form right here. So what we've done here is we've imported the integrity error from SQLalchemy exceptions. And instead of our application crashing, we should see username already taken. That looks much better. Let's try to add eShopik again. Let's put in no password, and you can see the field is required. That's great. Let's add eShopik again with a password. We can see username already taken, and that's great. We want to make sure that we try to preserve some form values, but also alert the user if the username has been taken. So right now, if I go to /users, I can see all of the users. So all of that process of creating a user and hashing a password, it doesn't get me very far unless I'm able to prevent certain users from accessing certain pages. In order to do that, we need to remember information about a user when they log in. And that information that we're going to store is in a place called the session. Inside of the session, we're going to store a little bit of information about that user who has either signed up or logged in. And then we're going to use a tool that you've seen before to make sure that only users who have logged in can access that specific page. Just to see what we've done so far, I'm going to add a new user. We'll call that foo and bar and nothing with a password of something I won't tell you. Let's just make sure that we did that correctly. I'm going to close the server, Control-C. I'm going to PSQL users messages bcrypt. And I'm going to quickly select star from users. And if I see inside of here, these passwords are being hashed successfully. You have no idea what these passwords are. Only the person who created these users has an idea of what the password is. That's the idea of one-way hashing, and that's a good thing. So it looks like I'm successfully hashing passwords, but I'm not really doing much in terms of preventing users from seeing certain pages. This is the idea of authentication. We need to make sure that a user is who we say they are. And that is usually where the process of logging in comes into play. So I'm going to, once again, start the server. But before we do that, let's just quickly head back to Sublime. And inside of here, we're going to need to add a little bit of logic into users views.py. Now, a very common question that's asked is, what exactly is the route for creating users? Should that be /signup? Should that be /user/new? What you want to call your routes is completely up to you. But what we're going to do right now is just say that user/new is where you go to sign up a user. In order to add a route for login, though, we're going to need a little bit more logic there. So what we're going to do is add to our user's blueprint a route for /login. And this is going to have a methods of get as well as post. We're also going to write a method called login. And how is this going to work? Well, when you log in, you want to make sure that we have some kind of form. So what we'll do is make a form, and we'll call that, make sure we spell that correctly. That's going to be our login form. But you might be wondering, hey, we don't have a login form, and you're absolutely right, we don't. So let's go make one. In our users forms, we're going to make a form called login form. And login form is going to inherit from Flask form, so we can get some CSRF protection. And what do we want inside of this form? Well, we just want the username and a password. This is going to be for users who have already been created, who we want. Once again, we have a username and a password, and that looks good. If we'd like in our templates, we can also make a new file, and we can call that login.html. And what I'm going to do is actually borrow a lot of the code from new.html in login, but instead, I'm going to say login instead of user. And here we'll say login. And then instead of users.index, we're going to do users.login. This is going to be a very similar form to what we have, but what we want to do is simply see if the user is putting in the correct username and password. So we can go make sure our server is started, python app.py. Let's head over to localhost 3000. Remember now you can go to any page that you want, but we're ideally going to make sure that only logged in users can go to certain pages. So I'm going to go to users login. It's going to tell me the requested URL was not found. That's not good. Let's make sure views.py is saved. And I need to actually add some logic here. We are going to return render template users/login.html. We're going to add a form, which is going to be our login form. That's all we're going to do here. Notice login form is still not imported, so I got to make sure that I bring that in as well. Let's go back, refresh the page. That looks a little bit better. Now there's a username and a password, but nowhere here am I actually handling what happens when this form is submitted. So we got to make sure back in login that we handle information in this form. So we'll say if request.method is post. And we could even add request.form right here. This will be empty on a get request. On a post request, it will be populated. So if request.method is post, we can see if form.validate. Well, what do we need to do here? We need to first see if the username exists. Then we need to see if the password is correct. And if so, log them in. Otherwise, we're going to redirect and say invalid credentials. We might flash that. So how could we handle all of this logic right here? Well, if it's a post, we want to see first off if the form validates. If the form doesn't validate to begin with, we're simply going to return login once again. We actually don't even need this else condition because no matter what, we're going to return login.html. So if it's a post, we're going to see if the form validates and go on our merry way. So how do we see if the username exists? This is going to be a little bit tricky, but what we're going to do is simply make a variable called foundUser, and that is going to be the result of user.query.filter_by. We are going to look for a username, which is coming from the form. And how do we get data from our forms again? Form.username.data. And this returns a list to us. We just want to get the first one. So we're going to see if that found user exists, if there is a found user. If there is, we're going to make another variable called authenticated user. And that's going to be the result of bcrypt.check password hash. And we're going to pass in found user dot password. This is going to be the result of the user that we found and the password that is coming in the form, form.password.data. And finally, if there is an authenticated user, we're just going to return the string logged in. If anything goes wrong here, any issues anywhere, we're simply going to return redirect. But before we do that, we'll quickly flash and we'll say return a redirect URL for users.login. So what do we do here? First, we're using bcrypt. Let's make sure we get that from project, import db and bcrypt. And let's go take a step back with all this code that we wrote. We're going to see in a little bit that we can really refactor this code into our model. But let's see step by step. If you go to /user/login, we're going to get you a form. And we're going to render users login. When you submit that form, request.form will be populated with information. If it is a post, we want to see right away if the form is valid. If the form is invalid, you left out a username and a password, then just send that form again with the error messages. But if the form actually does validate, let's go see if the username that you put in exists in the database. This is going to return none or an actual user object. If we do find that user object, we could even say is not none if we want to be really explicit, but if found user is enough. We're going to make a new variable authenticated user. And this is the result of bcrypt.check password hash. This accepts 2 passwords that are hashed and returns the Boolean true to us if they exist. And if not, we're simply going to flash invalid credentials. So what we can do here is simply add an IPython to see what all these variables are. So I'm going to go back to user/login. I'm going to make sure that my server is starting. Anytime you have a syntax error, the server is going to go down, so make sure that the server is starting. We'll log in with eShowpic and that password. And right now, it looks like we're in IPython. So what does that mean? It means that we've actually made it to authenticated user. Let's take a look at authenticated user. And we can see that it is true. That's because we've passed in the correct password when it's been hashed and compared with what's in the database. You could call this something like is authenticated. That might be a little bit easier to read as a Boolean. Let's go take a look at what found user is. Found user refers to that user that I have in the database, user.username. How about user.password? Do you think we'll see this? Well, we'll just see the hash password. You're never going to find that plain text one. First name and last name. Looks like I got all that information. What we want to do here is just store a little bit of information about this user who we've logged in a more permanent place. But let's not worry about that for now. Let's simply see what we get back, and it says logged in. Great. If I go back to users login and I put in nothing, the form doesn't validate, so it immediately gives me these error messages. And if I put in something that doesn't exist, I simply get invalid credentials. So what we're doing is correctly authenticating the user. Ideally, if you go to /users, I don't want you to see this page unless you're logged in. So if you didn't even log in, you could still go to this page. That's something we'll talk about in a second. But before we move on to solving this problem, we really need to clean up some of this code. A lot of this logic right here could be cleaned up and placed into the model. And what we're going to do inside of our models.py is we are going to write a class method called authenticate. We're going to write a class method, and we're going to call that authenticate. This is simply going to be invoked as user.authenticate, directly on the class. And this is going to accept first the class. It's then going to accept some username and some password. And what we want to do here is move some of our business logic to the model instead of cluttering up our views.py. Once again, we'll make a variable called foundUser, which is the result of the class itself, .query.filter by the same method we saw with username and username right here. Here, we're checking to see if whatever username you pass to the authenticate function is correct. We're going to get the first one. If there is a found user, we're simply going to then make a variable called isAuthenticated, and that's going to be the result of bcrypt.checkPasswordHash founduser.password. Found user refers to this one right here. And then whatever password is passed to the function. Once again, we'll then say if isAuthenticated, we will return that found user. Otherwise, we're simply going to return false. So this method is going to either return the user that has been found successfully, or it's going to return false. Now, where do we actually get to use this method? Well, in our views.py, we can clean up our code quite a bit. If the form validates, we can get rid of a lot of this code, and we can simply say authenticated user is the result of user.authenticate. That's that new class method that we wrote. And what do we pass in here? Just two parameters, form.username.data and form.password, data. And if there is an authenticated user, what are we going to do? Simply say you are logged in, and let's return a redirect URL for users index. Let's just go to users index. Otherwise, we're going to simply say invalid credentials. So what we've done is we moved a lot of that logic to our models.py. This shouldn't affect the behavior too much. Let's make sure we did this correctly. I'll go to users login. I'll put in a bunch of gibberish. Once again, invalid credentials, the form still validates. And if I put in correct information, I make it to users index. Now this is fantastic, but we still haven't solved the problem of anybody just going to /users right here. Nobody is getting stopped when we go to /users. We need a way to ensure that the user is authenticated before they make it to /users. And the way that we do that is by storing a little bit of information on the server when the user logs in. The place where we store that information is in an object called the session. And we can get access to the session from Flask. What we're going to do when a user is created or when a user is logged in, we could even do this for both, we're going to add a little bit of information to the session. We're going to add in the session a key of user ID and a value of whatever that user is and its ID property. So we're going to access the ID property on that user. We're going to do something very similar when we create a user as well. We're going to say session right here, but instead of authenticated user, because we don't have it, we're going to use that new user that we make. And we're going to redirect to users index. This is actually going to log us in. This is going to store some information in the session as well as information on a cookie in the browser. So in case the server goes down, the cookie can actually help keep us logged in and restart or restore the session. So how do we know if we've done this correctly? Well, what we need to do is write a little bit of logic to make sure that if you have logged in successfully, you can access a certain page. And we might do that by intercepting the request and continuing normally or redirecting. A great way to do that is through a decorator. What we're going to do is make a couple decorators. To do that, we're going to stop the server, and inside of project, we're going to make a folder called decorators. And we're going to make a file inside of decorators called dunder-init.py. So when we do something like from decorators import, that's going to refer to the dunder-init.py file. Let's go back, start this server again, and let's go start working on our decorators file. Inside of dunder-init.py, I would like to make some decorators. So first off, I'm going to import from functools the wraps function. This is going to ensure that I get the right dunder doc and dunder name property. I'm also going to get a couple things from Flask, including redirect, URL for, session, and flash. I want the session so I can check to see if some information is there. And I'm going to make sure I get the word import here. And now I actually have to use these. So I'm going to make a decorator called ensure authenticated. And this is going to accept some kind of function. I'm going to then use the wraps decorator so that I correctly preserve my dunder name and dunder doc for this decorator. And I'll make some kind of function. You can call that wrapper or inner. It's going to take some number of arguments and some number of keyword arguments. I'm going to check and see if there is not anything when we try to get a user ID in the session. This is the same thing as saying if session get user ID is none. We could do that as well. What do we want to do here? We want to flash and say, please log in first. We're then going to return a redirect to which URL to user's login. So what this means is if someone tries to access some route, this decorator is going to check if there is anything for user ID in the session. When does that happen? That happens when you log in or sign up. And if that is none, we're going to tell them, please log in first. Otherwise, we don't actually even need this else here because we're simply just going to return whatever we were doing before with all the arguments and keyword arguments passed to it. Finally, with our decorators, we always return that inner function. So we have made a decorator that first preserves dunder name and dunder doc. That's what we can use wraps for. Here, we're going to see if there is a user ID in the session. If not, send a flash message and redirect to the login page. Otherwise, continue as usual. And finally, with our decorators, we always return the inner function. In our case, we call that wrapper. So this is just one decorator that we're going to use. But where do we actually get to use that decorator? Let's do that in our views.py. Inside of here, we're going to say from project.decorators import ensure authenticated. And what do we do with this ensure authenticated decorator? We might want to use it on things like our user's index page, or on things like our edit page or new page, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do here is isolate our index route right here, because I still want to make sure that you can post to /index when you do that correctly. So I'm going to make another user's blueprint route to /. And all that I'm going to do here is simply make a file called index. Now, you know that we can't call this index here, so I'm actually going to call this create. Or better yet, we can call this sign up. And this is going to happen. Remember, we're going to need delete form over here. I'm not too worried about if the method is post. So all we're doing here is simply isolating our get and our post so that we can make sure that you're logged in when you make a get request. If you make a post request to /users, that's signing up. I don't want to make sure you're logged in yet. So what we're going to do here is simply grab the user form, and if it validates, go with our logic as per usual. And if you go to the regular index page, we're going to pass in this right here. I also want to make sure that this is correctly indented. So we'll simply say, if the form is validated, go on and do that. One other thing I want to do is always make sure that ensure authenticated is after that route. That's going to be really important. You always want to make sure that you go to the route first and then run that decorator. What I'd also like to think about doing is logging out a user. So I'm going to add a little bit of code at the bottom for one more route, and that's going to be users blueprint dot route to, and I'll add a little bit more space right here. That's going to be to /logout. And this is simply just going to be a get. I'll make sure that you're logged in if you try to log out. And then we'll write a method called logout, which is simply going to remove the user ID from the session. We can then flash logged out, and we can return a redirect back to users login. Make sure I do redirect URL for users login. So let's go save that. And back in the browser, I'm going to go to users/login. And it's going to tell me to log in first. If I try to do something like users log out, it's going to tell me please log in first. if I try to go right now to users/index, or just the index page right now, it's still going to tell me to log in first. How is that happening? Well, remember that we're using a decorator called ensure authenticated here. And inside of here, we actually don't have any information in the session yet because I added this code after I logged in. So I'm going to log in with the correct information, eShowpic, and my password. And once I log in, I can now see all of the users. If I go to /logout, it'll tell me I'm logged out. And if I try to go back to users, it's actually going to tell me to log in first. So what we've implemented right now is a really, really easy way to make sure that you are authenticated if you try to access a certain page. I'm going to add this decorator as well to things like the edit page. Always remember the decorator comes after your route. We'll do that for editing and deleting as well. And what this means is that if we do something like logout, we try to go to users/1/edit, it's going to tell us, please log in first. You can't edit until you've logged in. There's still one more problem that you may be thinking about here, which is, well, can user 1 edit user 2? And the answer is yes right now. We'll have to change that. But there actually is one small thing that I want to focus on first. If we go to users login, and we log in correctly, and we go to users login, once again, we can actually log in another time. This isn't a very big problem, but you shouldn't be able to log in more than once. So what I'd like to do is make another decorator to prevent me from logging in and signing up multiple times. We can call that prevent login sign up. And that accepts a function. We'll make sure we add wraps to that as well, pass in that function, and then we'll make an inner function called wrapper, which accepts some args and some keyword args. And let's make sure we spell wrapper correctly. Now inside of here, what do we want to do? We'll say if there actually is something in the session for a user ID. If that does exist, then tell them you are logged in already and return a redirect URL for. And where do we want to go now? We can simply say users index. Otherwise, we'll just return the function with all the arguments and keyword arguments passed to it and return the wrapper. So what we're trying to do here is simply say, if there is a user ID in the session already, then tell them that they're logged in. Then they don't have to actually go back and log in again. Where would we add this decorator? Well, let's think where we might need to add this inside of our views.py. First thing we want to do is make sure that we import prevent login signup, and then we're going to use this decorator when someone might try to log in or sign up again, or maybe someone goes to the login form and submits that again. Let's go see what that looks like. If I refresh the page right now, it's going to say you're logged in already. That's great. Now on this users index page, it would be nice if we just made a quick link to logout. So what I'll do over here is make a quick link to URL for users.logout. And it's going to say logout. And it's going to say list object has no attribute logout. What could happen here? Well, if I take a look right here, it seems like I'm trying to do something URL for users logout. And that's the problem because I need to add this in quotes. So be really careful with that. I'll go back here and I log out, and I'm back here. I can log in again. I can log out. If I try to go back to users new, it's going to tell me I can add a new user. We should have some decorator on that. So let's go back to our views and let's make sure that once again, if you've logged in or signed up already, you shouldn't be able to see this form. Let's go back to users/new. That looks much better. I try to go back here. It's not going to let me. If I log out and I try to go and make a new user, that's totally fine. I can sign up, I can log in, but I can't see all of the users until I log in first. That's the idea of authentication, making sure that you are who you say that you are. There's a lot going on here, a lot of material here, but there are only two more things that we need to get through. The second thing that we need to think about is when we add a new user, you see right here, user is new. It's actually not going to let me do that because we can't keep adding new users. We simply have to just sign up again. So let's go to users new, and we'll make a user whose name is Matt, and we'll give that a username and a password. And what we really don't want to happen is we don't want Matt to be able to edit Ellie. Right now, Matt is the one who's logged in, but he just edited Ellie. So what we want to do is prevent users from changing information about other users. This is the idea of authorization. And in order to do that, we're going to need to add another decorator. What we're going to do inside of our decorators is add one for ensure correct user. You could call this authorize or whatever you like. Once again, we're going to wraps. And what we're going to do here is simply write another function called wrapper with args and keyword args. Now remember that each time that you access a specific page for a user, there's going to be something inside of those keyword arguments. What does that mean? Let's throw an IPython right here. And before we do that, we'll simply just return all done, and then we'll return from the wrapper. All I want to see here is the keyword args. I'm going to add ensure correct user onto the edit as well. Got to make sure we also import ensure correct user. So back in the browser, I'll refresh the page, try to edit a user for Ellie, and let's go take a look in IPython at what keyword arguments is. If you see right here inside of keyword arguments, there's a property called ID, because if you remember, inside of request, we actually don't have that, unfortunately. All we have are the keyword arguments right now. That's coming from the request from the URL right there. That URL itself is users/6/edit. So what we're going to do with this decorator is go into those keyword arguments and see if it matches what is stored in the session. We'll make a variable called correct ID, and that will be the result of keyword args.get user, in this case not the user ID, just the ID. And we can say if correct ID is not session.get user ID, if that's not what has been stored in the session, if you are not from the URL, the person who has logged in, well, what can we do here? Simply flash not authorized, and then return a redirect to a URL for users index. And how do we make sure that we handle anything that is not the correct ID? We simply flash. That's it. Just saying not authorized. Once we're done with that, we can return the wrapper. But if it is the correct ID, let's return a function with the correct arguments and the correct keyword arguments. A lot of moving parts here. We'll come back to this decorator. Let's just see if it works. Let's go back to users. Let's go try to edit a user. And there we go, not authorized. That looks good. How about things like deleting a user? Well, let's go make sure inside of our views.py, let's add this ensure correct user for the show action as well. If we refresh the page, Matt should not be able to delete Ellie. That looks good. Can't delete Ellie and can't edit Ellie. This is the idea of authorization, making sure that users are authorized to interact with other users. How are we doing this? Let's go back to the decorator. Once again, what do we do with that wraps right there? Preserves, dunder name, and dunder doc. Here we're just doing a function called wrapper that accepts a variable number of arguments and a variable number of keyword arguments. Here, we get from keyword arguments a property ID. This comes from /users/ some kind of ID. That's where we're getting that from. If the ID from the URL is the same as the one in the session, or better yet, if it is not, the ID from the URL is not the same, then we're going to send a message saying not authorized. And we're going to redirect back to users index. Otherwise, continue as usual. A similar kind of idea to what we had above, except here we're just checking to see, is there anything in the session? Has anyone logged in? Here we're checking to see, has the person who has logged in, are they actually the correct user for what we're trying to do? This is where you might have additional logic if you want to make users admins, or if some users can alter other users' properties. Here's where you add that kind of logic. Now, I'm not going to add the logic for messages. I'm going to challenge you to implement very, very similar authentication and authorization logic for messages. You're not going to have to change too much. You might have to alter this decorator just a little bit, but you should be able to take what we've done and add a little bit more logic to make sure that if you are making some kind of message, you're logged in before you try to do that. Now, there's one more thing that I want to do, because this is going to be very useful with some conditional logic. We're going to see later on that there's a module called Flask-Login that helps us with this type of logic. But what we're going to introduce is the idea of a current user. And a current user is simply the user object that has logged in. And what we'd like to be able to do is access that user information anywhere across all of our pages. We could do that by placing the entire user in the session, but that's a bit overkill. What we're going to introduce is the idea of something called G. And G is an object in Flask that can be shared between requests. So what we are going to do is add a decorator to our user's blueprint called before request. Before that request is handled, we're going to write a method called current user. And what we're going to do here is simply say if session.get user ID, if there is something in the session for user ID, we're going to add a property onto G called current user. Remember, G is something we can access anywhere in our views and anywhere in our templates as well. And we'll say user.query.get session at the key of user ID. Otherwise, we're simply going to say g.currentUser is going to be none. We're going to see how to use this current user later, but this is very important for doing things like showing a nav bar where you want to say login or log out, depending on if someone is logged in. Current user is very helpful for that. And we're simply going to run this method and define something on G before every single request. So where could we use this? Well, quickly in our index.html, we could do something that says welcome back g.currentUser.username. Let's go save this, head back to the browser. Let's go refresh the page. And it says welcome back, Matt. Well, that's pretty cool. All we did is use g.currentUser that got defined before every request. And if there is not anything inside of here, we can simply do something like set g.currentUser to be none. Where might we use this? We might actually use this in our base.html. What we can do right here is make a simple paragraph. And here we can say if g.currentUser will end if. Here we'll simply say a link to URL for users.logout. And here we'll say logout. There you go. We don't even need the paragraph tag. Let's keep it simple. Otherwise, we'll say login. Let's go save that, take a look. And here it says logout, and here it says login. How does that work? Because before every request, we check to see if there is some user that actually exists. And when we go and log in with this information, we can log out, and here we'll see this login button again. If we go to user/new, we can see, oh, here's a way to log in. That's great. We've added a little bit of conditional logic based on the idea of this variable called current user that exists on G. What is the idea of G? Simply, you can think of it like a global variable that you can use in your templates and anywhere in your views.py and place properties on it that you can use in your templates. This is much better for adding larger things that you'll use in your templates and not adding things in the session, which persists amongst every single request. This is going to be called every time before a request. The session is simply going to be storing information once where you can add and delete later points in time. A lot of things that we've gone over here. We've done password hashing. We've seen how to authenticate users. We saw how to fix even things like migrations and add more forms. What I challenge you to do is take this application, go through the code and make sure you understand it or ask questions, head over to the messages part and build the logic necessary to ensure that you have the correct user when you're trying to edit a message and ensure that users have to be logged in before they edit messages. It's going to be much less work than what we've done. You're going to use your decorators inside of the messages model, and you'll be on your way to building a full stack application with authentication and authorization. I'll see you in the next screencast.